it does actually bring us to our next question, which comes from the former military intelligence officer known as Witness J, whose identity remains suppressed. J served in East Timor, Iraq and Afghanistan and was trialled and sentenced in secret for national security offences. So we obviously can't identify him, but the question from Witness J, the veteran community is hurting deeply at the moment. I am hurting, he says. Our pain is only a drop in the bucket to what many Afghans are feeling. Before my deployment to Afghanistan a decade ago, our commanding officer told us Australia's involvement was to assure the US that we were a dependable ally and that once we left, the Afghan government was likely doomed to fail. Given this, he says, why couldn't our political leaders tell the country the obvious truth, that we were there solely to prove to the US that should the time come, we would fight with them so that they may intervene on our behalf in any future existential military crisis. Lydia, is supporting the United States, supporting that alliance, one of, if not the main reason we went in? And is it a legitimate reason?
It's certainly one of the main reasons that Australia's involvement in Afghanistan. It's not the only one. I think that Australia did have legitimate concerns about international terrorism coming out of Afghanistan. Australian interests and Australian people have been targeted by al-Qaeda and international jihadists that came out of there. So I think they were both important reasons for Australia's involvement in Afghanistan to begin with. And I think that they were both equally legitimate. But I think that once the mission creep started to happen, once we started to see the limitations of that military involvement, you know, the truth of that and the limitations of that should have been properly understood and factored in to Australia's involvement in Afghanistan.
Daniel, let me just ask you on that. Is that why you felt you were there as well?
For me, look, that's pretty simple. I was there for the men and women to the left and to the right of me on the ground. It's as simple as that. I went, they went, we served our country, the government of the day. I have no questions at all of why we went, or no issues for why we went across there. At the start of the program, you know, I said that I fought beside the Afghan National Army as well. For me, it was absolutely about human rights. You know, those friends that I have or had whilst I was in country, the Afghan National Army. You know, for me, it was about creating a better tomorrow for them. So yes, there was a number of issues throughout. That's without a doubt. I'm, for one, who's been in combat and situations like that, that every step that you could take could be your last. I'm not going to sit here and question some of the decisions that were made. But let's be honest, mistakes were made.
Do you ever feel, though, Daniel, as though while you're on the ground there, that politics was holding back what you were able to do, was getting in the way of doing what you needed to do?
Politics or resources, depends on how you want to look at this problem. Without a doubt, more resources on the ground, I think our mission would have been vastly different to what we achieved. I think we could have achieved so much more if we had the resources available to do that.
If I could interject here, David, I think, you know, with all due respect to the veteran community out there who are genuinely feeling this and the pain is palpable, and they have also signed on to our petitions calling for the humanitarian intake. You know, they've been platformed quite extensively, but I just worry about how the experiences of Afghans are once again being sidelined. We did not choose for this war to happen. It's an imperialist intervention that was unlawful in 2001 following 9/11.
You're saying that intervention would have been better had there not been an intervention?
We just need to be mindful of this narrative. It's very, it's become quite simplistic and a binary between the Taliban and the intervention and allied forces. We can sit here and hold a multifaceted approach. We as Afghans can sit here and critique our own government for a plethora of reasons, for corruption or, you know, war profiteering. We can sit here and also critique the intervention and allied forces and what has transpired in the last 20 years since the intervention. Yes, gains were made once that intervention happened, undeniably so, that is a fact. However, since then, you know, we don't want the Taliban either. So we can have all of these feelings, and as well, it's not one or either or situation. My point is that, you know, we have to actually take stock of where we are in history right now. Have we learned anything from this intervention? Do we want to go back to another 20 years, 30 years, another Iraq, another Taliban 2.0, another Afghanistan? And this is where Australia does have to reassess its foreign policy priorities and interests, to go into another war and see our war veterans who are clearly in pain. Absolutely, but the Afghans are too.
Absolutely.
We have experienced collective trauma, intergenerational trauma. I've never even known my grandparents. My parents are so foreign in terms of how they've been able to flee as refugees in the middle of the night. And in all of this, the voices of Afghans consistently and continuously gets drowned out. And I just want to be really mindful that we need to be centred, our experiences need to be centred, and our voices need to be heard right now.
Well, yeah, David, I think something, David, I think something needs to be said here, and that is, it's very hard to imagine that Australia would not have entered the war in Afghanistan. Despite it ended up being a coalition of over 40 nations. All of NATO was there. It was said to be the biggest coalition in history. The issue really is the mission creep, turning it from a war to take out Al-Qaeda, to banish them for good, to eliminate their camps, to create a situation where there was some help to the development of a central government that had authority in Kabul that would not allow the Taliban to take over again. But it turned out to be a very drawn out, a very attenuated process, and the mission changed. In fact, the mission was rather vague. It was George Bush saying, America will be there, America will never give up. It became that most dangerous of things for America, that is, an attempt to prove its dominance. And as with the Vietnam War, America's leadership carried on, as the Afghanistan papers are now confirming, carried on the war knowing it couldn't achieve any reasonable strategic objectives. Yeah. It kept the war going as it kept Vietnam going, and that really was a tragedy.
Despite what we were told, Lydia.
Could I just make an interjection with all due respect to the need to centre Afghan voices on this? I mean, it's not correct to say that this was an illegal intervention. This is one that got the approval of the United Nations, was as a coalition, as was mentioned before. This was a justified intervention at the beginning that had the approval and the support of a large coalition and the approval of the United Nations Security Council. But as we saw, and has been already mentioned, so I won't belabor it, you know, all of that has been lost at the length of this war. It's been 2 decades. And at the certain point, you know, it was clear that we were not achieving what we needed to achieve. But it's important to clarify, though, that initial...
At the outset, it did have the UN Security Council backing for that ISAF mission. Look, I do want to point out, and Darren Chester touched on this earlier, if this discussion, and particularly for veterans, but for anyone really, whether it has raised issues for you, and we know members of the Afghan community too, as Diana has pointed out, the numbers for Lifeline and Open Arms are there on your screen, so please give those a call.